And now to last witnesses. Erica Harth is a professor of humanities and women's studies at Brandeis University. The 17 essays in this particular book, Last Witnesses, move through a range of issues and attitudes about race, gender, war, and America's identity. The issues are very, very tough, sometimes harsh, but very important for us to look at. So would you please join with the CLSC in welcoming editor and author Erica Harth and the book Last Witnesses.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I'm delighted and honored to be here, and I especially want to thank Jeff Miller and Kathleen Crocker and Frida Piles for all of the superb arrangements they've made for this event. The title of my talk is Loyalty and Liberty in Critical Times, the Case of the Japanese-American Internment. And maybe the key phrase here is in critical time. The title of my talk is Loyalty and Liberty in Critical Times, the Case of the Japanese-American Internment. And maybe the key phrase here is in critical times, because what I'm going to talk about today is the linkage between what happened in the 1940s and World War II and what's happening today after September 11th. Of course, before September 11th, I might have prepared a very different talk, but now there's really increased interest in the internment and increased importance in looking back on it. In March of this year, the Justice Department announced an increase of 3,000 over the initial 5,000 Middle Eastern and Muslim men in the United States wanted for questioning. That makes a total of 8,000. The roundup of hundreds who've been placed in federal custody, the prospect of military tribunals, the suspension of rules of confidentiality between lawyers and imprisoned terrorist suspects, the USA Patriot Act of 2001, the broadening of the FBI's powers of search and surveillance, and other anti-terrorist measures following September 11th constitute what Anthony Romero, Executive Director of the American Civil Liberties Union, has called, and I quote, the greatest challenge to civil liberties since World War II. Romero's comment, of course, refers to the forced removal and incarceration of up to 120,000 ethnic Japanese following Pearl Harbor. Whenever I've talked about the internment, the question has inevitably arisen, could it happen again? No one answer to this question quite satisfies. A lot has happened in 60 years, the optimists will say. The American public won't tolerate racial profiling so easily now. Above all, we have a precedent to avoid, and yet we're worried, we continue to worry. After September 11th, some might say, we told you so, to which others might counter, but it isn't the same. You can't compare today's anti-terrorist initiatives with the roundup and imprisonment of an entire ethnic population, innocent one and all. So let's try to reframe the debate. On September 12th, the banner headline of the Boston Globe read, New Day of Infamy. Articles started appearing in the New York Times and elsewhere with titles such as War on Terrorism Stirs Memory of Internment. Scary signs popped up, indicating that civil liberties might start playing second fiddle to security. 2 months after the attack on the World Trade Center, one poll revealed that 64% of the public believed that in wartime, the president should have the authority to change or abridge constitutional rights. 10 months later, however, despite the racial profiling of Muslim and Middle Eastern men in the United States and the detention of hundreds, despite the camp for terrorist suspects at Guantanamo, there has been no actual reprise of the internment. So would it be premature to conclude that it can't happen again? It all depends on what you mean by it. If you mean the literal incarceration of an entire ethnic group, including American citizens, 2/3 of the incarcerated Japanese Americans were American citizens, by the way. You could argue that it might be difficult to pull it off in the 21st century. But if it is understood to mean an abrogation of civil liberties so serious that it recalls the threat to our Constitution in World War II, then I would argue that we have a serious issue on our hands. I'd like to raise a few disturbing questions about the sturdiness of our historical memory before I go on to discuss the problem of loyalty during the period of the internment and beyond. The lawyers among you know the Korematsu case very well. Every law student studies it. But for those of you who don't know, Korematsu was the chief constitutional case to come out of the internment. Fred Korematsu was one of 3 young Japanese American men who deliberately challenged or resisted the orders relating to internment, curfew, evacuation, or removal to the camps. All 3 test cases reached the Supreme Court. Fred Korematsu was so determined to avoid internment that he underwent plastic surgery to alter his appearance and doctored his draft card. He just wanted to stay with his Caucasian fiancée. He was apprehended on a tip. The Supreme Court handed down its decision on Korematsu's case in 1944, ruling in effect that the internment was constitutional. The argument of military necessity, later revealed as bankrupt because of the government's deliberate suppression of evidence, won out 6-3. One of the 3 dissenters, Justice Robert Jackson, is a native son of these parts, as I learned from Kathleen Crocker, and there's a local Jackson Center devoted to him, and we're lucky enough to have Greg Peterson of the Jackson Center with us today, doing videotaping, by the way. In the 1980s, Korematsu's conviction was overturned in federal district court, as were those of the other 2 resistors, Gordon Hirabayashi and Minoru Yasui. None of the decisions addressed the issue of constitutionality. Korematsu has, until recently at least, remained the most infamous of the wartime internment cases in its flagrant disregard of constitutional rights. In his dissent, Justice Jackson said that the court's decision on Korematsu would produce, and I'm quoting, a loaded weapon ready for the hand of any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim of an urgent need. Prophetic words. In December 2001, lawyers supportive of the Bush administration's anti-terrorist measures started to brandish the weapon. C. Boyden Gray, who had been White House counsel to the first President Bush, was saying of September 11th, there has been the equivalent of a declaration of war. The New York Times reported that lawyers in support of the administration had charged critics of its policies with ignoring, and I'm quoting, Supreme Court precedents that approved such extreme wartime actions as the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II. In a sidebar to this Times article were sources cited by supporters of the administration, one of which was Korematsu. Fred Korematsu, who won the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1998, said at age 82 after September 11th, quote, I don't know if it's going to happen again. But he sees what he calls, again, quote, a tough fight. It was unconstitutional then and it's unconstitutional now. The fact is that the 1944 Korematsu decision was implicitly discredited, not only by the vacating of Fred Korematsu's conviction 40 years later, but also by the passage of the Civil Liberties Act in 1988. This act, the culmination of the Japanese American community's national movement for redress of the injustice committed in the internment, was accompanied by a national apology. By the Act's provisions, each former internee was to receive $20,000 in reparations. The shadow of the internment hovers even more ominously over more recent developments in the current anti-terrorist campaign. How can we balance liberty and security? How can we apply the lessons of the internment to the present? To go back now to 1942, What was it that made possible the mass incarceration of an innocent people? What was the prevailing conception of loyalty and disloyalty? What feelings and rationalizations underlay the policy to intern? To historians of the internment, one of its most striking features is not what was alleged, but what was omitted or suppressed. The military officials who advocated internment publicly claimed that military necessity allowed no time to separate the wheat from the chaff, to decide who among the population in question might be disloyal. So internment was touted as a preventive measure or preemptive strike. Without knowledge of who among the group might be disloyal, the safest procedure was to lock up everyone: babies, the aged, the infirm, orphan children, everyone. But the government had received reliable intelligence on the Japanese Americans' loyalty well before President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066 of February 19, 1942, which mandated military exclusion zones on the West Coast and thereby laid the grounds for the internment. Lieutenant Commander Kenneth D. Ringel of the Office of Naval Intelligence had drafted a report on the ethnic Japanese in which he underestimated as it turns out, that 90% of the group was assuredly loyal. Meanwhile, General John L. DeWitt, Western Defense Commander, had said in his final report on the West Coast evacuation of 1942 that it was impossible to distinguish the loyal from the disloyal ethnic Japanese, not because there wasn't enough time to make the determination, but because Japanese Americans were such a tightly knit racial group. When John J. McCloy, Assistant Secretary of War, came to prepare the government's brief for Hirabayashi, one of the 3 test cases of the internment, Korematsu, remember, was another, he realized that the language in DeWitt's final report was racist and that the final report would also be needed as evidence. So that language would surely be vulnerable on the account of due process. As a result, DeWitt was ordered to revise his final report, and the first version of the final report didn't see the light of day until it was rediscovered in the 1980s. The Ringel report was similarly suppressed. It was the uncovering of the suppressed material in the 1980s that clinched the vacating of the wartime resistors' Supreme Court cases at that time. Suspicions of the Japanese Americans' disloyalty were based on a systematic conflation of the ethnic Japanese in this country with the Japanese enemy abroad. The enemy was sneaky and untrustworthy. It didn't look like us. Consequently, the ethnic Japanese in this country were judged to be the same. Acting on this racist assumption immediately after Pearl Harbor, the FBI rounded up some 5,000 Issei, that is, the first or immigrant generation, and Nisei, the second generation, who were born here and so American citizens. Over 2,000 among these suspects were sent to remote Justice Department detention camps for an indefinite stay, even in some cases for the duration of the war. The people pulled in were generally community leaders, heads of civic associations, men in the import-export business, and so on. Husbands and fathers would just disappear and were often not heard from for months. Frightened families waited for their turn, some keeping a packed bag in readiness. Racism was only one factor, though, in placing the ethnic Japanese under suspicion. It had to combine with others in order to produce the shadow of disloyalty. Prominent among these factors, we know, was economic competition. On the West Coast, the Japanese immigrants were disproportionately successful growers, and once they were interned, rivals were only too eager to move in on their land. Discrediting your neighbor turned out to be profitable. There was ample, but not good, reason then for the public to let internment occur with hardly a murmur. Only a handful of individuals and groups spoke out on the matter, notably the Quakers and the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. The National Board of the American Civil Liberties Union was torn by inner conflicts, and so the ACLU ended up waffling ignominiously, although individual lawyers such as Wayne Collins, Ernest Bessie, and A.L. Weirin were indefatigable in their efforts on behalf of the targeted population. The Hearst press whipped up paranoia as stories of tomato plants positioned by Japanese American farmers so as to signal the enemy, and other tall tales were served up to the public in its pages. Racism, economics, and the terror of war on home territory combined to place an entire ethnic population under suspicion of disloyalty. Here I'm going to leave outside perceptions of Japanese American disloyalty for a moment and turn to the incarcerated population's experience of itself when it was deprived of liberty and branded as a subversive or potentially subversive group. What do you do when your loyalty is questioned on the sole basis of your ethnicity? I would like to emphasize that in all the instances of suspected or disputed loyalty that I've cited so far, the standards of loyalty have been far from clear. No one of the loyalty tests seem to be definitive. During times of perceived national emergency, of course, one thing is clear. You're disloyal if you're engaging in sabotage, espionage, or other subversive activity. But how do you prove not only that you're not subversive, but that also you're not potentially subversive? Remember that not one case of sabotage or espionage was ever proven among the ethnic Japanese of this country. Or how do you prove positively that you're loyal? It wasn't enough to prove that you were willing to lay down your life for your country. Returning Nisei soldiers, like returning African American soldiers who also fought in segregated units, were not protected by their uniform from being spat upon, literally. It was not enough to prove that you weren't a spy because you were told that you could become one just because of your face. What are the badges of loyalty? Even children in the camps felt the importance of these questions very deeply. Younger children readily absorbed the patriotism that was built into their daily lessons. In my first grade class at Manzanar, one of the two California camps, we began the day with the Pledge of Allegiance and songs like America the Beautiful. When I visited the Manzanar archives at UCLA, I found that the children's writings and copies of our school newspaper, the Manzanar Whirlwind, were filled with the American spirit. Here are some examples from a fourth grader. The Statue of Liberty is big and tall. The light in the torch is very bright. It can be seen far out at sea. People say it is very beautiful. I wish I could see it. Two fifth grade girls wrote a poem called Our Flag, which goes like this. Our flag is waving high against the light blue sky. We salute to you. We sing to our banner in a gallant manner. Dear red, white, and blue, we stand up for you. We all sing while liberty reigns. Dear red, white, and blue, we remove our hat for you. Older children could be more cynical. I'll read you a poem titled That Damn Fence from a high school boy who called himself the Mad Mongolian. They've sunk the posts deep in the ground and they've sprung barbed wire all the way around. With machine gun nests just over there, there are sentries and soldiers everywhere. We're trapped like rats in a wire cage to fret and fume with impotent rage. Yonder we seek the life of the night, but that damned fence is flooded with light. We seek the softness of the midnight air, but that damned fence is in the floodlight glare. They see unrest in our nocturnal quest and mockingly laugh with vicious jest. With nowhere to go and nothing to do, we feel terribly lonesome and blue. That damned fence is driving us crazy, destroying our youth and making us lazy. Loyalty we know and patriotism feel. To sacrifice our utmost was our ideal. To fight for our country and die, perhaps, yet we are prevented because we are Japs. We all love life and our country best, yet it's our misfortune to be here in the West. To keep us penned up behind that damned fence is someone's notion of national defense. I don't have a date for this poem. The first two that I read date from 1945, but judging from the lines about being denied military service, it must have been written before recruitment for the 442nd, therefore before early 1943. The poem suggests something extremely sad. Deprivation of civil and human rights can make even the most loyal citizen start to question his or her commitment. A case in point. By March 1945, over 5,000 Japanese Americans had taken advantage of a bill passed by Congress in the previous summer that permitted voluntary renunciation of citizenship. It's doubtful that they would ever have dreamed of taking such a step before the internment. And in fact, the overwhelming majority of these renunciants later changed their minds. Ironically, it was only with extreme difficulty and the persistence of lawyer Wayne Collins over more than 2 decades that they succeeded finally in regaining their American citizenship. Similarly, only 8,000 of 20,000 camp inmates who requested repatriation to Japan did actually leave the United States. Circling back now to my opening comments and questions, the internment of Japanese Americans is not a thing of the past. September 11th has made us acutely aware of its shadow, but even before then, it had been working as a precedent and a threat. The revisiting of the Korematsu case in the 1980s did not get beyond federal district court. So the original decision in 1944 of the Supreme Court still stands. In his essay for my book, Alan Austin has eloquently demonstrated the dangers of what he calls the Japanese-American precedent. And I'll briefly tell you about what he says in order to illustrate not only the need for constant vigilance in the matter of civil liberties, but also the need for historical memory, for awareness of the internment as an unfinished story. Austin writes about the Internal Security Act, also known as the McCarran Act, a piece of legislation passed by Congress in 1950 that required communist organizations with the Attorney General. The date of the legislation alone reminds us of how closely the McCarthy period followed on the heels of the internment and of the continuing preoccupation with questions of loyalty. Indeed, the Dies Committee, later to become the House Un-American Activities Committee, played a role in the internment too. In 1943, it initiated investigations into the policies of the War Relocation Authority. The committee was concerned about giving leave clearance to possible disloyals, and it even probed into the cost of food in the camps. The Hearst Press and others had charged the WRA with being soft on Japs and coddling its wards. The allotment of up to 45 cents a day per head for food in the camps was seen as extravagant. Why should the taxpayers have to put up with such an expense? And it is Title II of the Internal Security Act, however, that interests us the most. Title II, known as the Concentration Camp Clause, authorized detention of possible subversive during times of an internal security emergency declared by the President. Not only does Title II seem to be directly modeled on Executive Order 9066 and the internment of Japanese Americans, as Austin argues, he further tells us that between 1952 and 1957, Congress appropriated monies to ready 6 detention centers across the country. Eerily enough, Tule Lake, the camp used for segregation of the so-called disloyal Japanese American inmates, was selected as one of the sites. This story ends happily. Title II was never invoked, and no national emergency was ever declared. In 1971, the law was repealed, and Japanese Americans played a leading role in the movement to repeal. In his essay, Austin points out that the legislation of 1971 did not only repeal the Concentration Camp Clause, it also amended the relevant section of the United States Code to read, "No citizen shall be imprisoned or otherwise detained by the United States, except pursuant to an act of Congress." Austin argues, as does Roger Daniels, our premier historian of the internment, that the amendment is no guarantee against another internment, and I agree with their assessment. For as long as the Supreme Court does not overturn Korematsu or otherwise rule against the constitutionality of the internment, We cannot feel protected against such an eventuality. Austin reminds us of a warning issued in 1949 by Morton Brodsons in his book, Americans Betrayed. I'm quoting Brodsons. The process of government is a continuing process. What it produced for Japanese Americans, it can also produce for other Americans. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we've not yet had a literal reprise of the internment, and we hope that it will never happen again. But we would be remiss not to look back to the wartime precedent, not to keep our historical memory alive, not to relax our vigilance. My warnings aren't mentioned to diminish the danger posed by Pearl Harbor in 1941 or the attack on the World Trade Center 60 years later. The question is, what is the appropriate response at home? How do you preserve civil liberties in times of danger? Let me remind you, too, of the capital difference between Pearl Harbor and September 11th. Although C. Boyden Gray, the former White House counsel to the first President Bush, whom I cited earlier, speaks of the equivalent of a declaration of war. In the recent case, there has been no formal declaration of war. But in the case of the internment, we must ask if even the declaration of war justified such a measure. Japanese American and Asian American organizations have demonstrated special concern over the current administration's anti-terrorist measures. Each year, on or around February 19th, the anniversary of Executive Order 9066, local chapters of the Japanese American Citizens League sponsor Day of Remembrance events. This year, in several chapters across the country, the event was co-sponsored with Arab American and Muslim American organizations. This solidarity recalls the leading role played by Japanese Americans in the repeal of the Internal Security Act. But I don't want to leave historical memory to the injured alone. As Japanese American community leader Sue Embry, another of my contributors, has said, this can happen to anyone. The title of Brodson's book about the internment, Americans Betrayed, perhaps best expresses the ongoing meaning of the internment. It's an American story that involves us all and that demands of us all that we be attentive to its dangers and to its implications for our lives today. Thank you.